So what you're discussing is setting broader policy. Could the board, on a case-by-case basis, actually either withhold funding, not approve LCAPs? I mean, you're talking broad policy for the entire state. We're talking about a specific instance of a specific school district.
Sure. The board is not approving any LCAPs. It'll be those district LCAPs will be approved by the County Office of Education, and as long as they meet the requirements, they will be approved. And again, as long as they continue to meet the outcomes that they've laid out and meet the goals, then those will be approved going forward based on current statute as it's written.
So then, who actually, and forgive me for not knowing this, but who, either on the local level or state level, would have the authority to deal with this problem? Because it doesn't appear that the state board has that authority.
Sure. The way statute is set out, county offices have control over approving an LCAP, but of course, that doesn't speak directly to this problem. So as to, a local board is really going to be the ones who approve a compensation package, as long as they're also approving an LCAP that is also approved by the County Office of Education, then it would be approved. So this really is a local decision. Again, I'll note under current statute, they have to balance this out with other things, but there's no, within the LCAP statute, in LCFF, there's no specific statute that addresses, I'd say, that exact problem. Okay.
I'd like to switch topics for a second, if that's okay. I know I attended your January meeting as the board approved its regulations. I think I was very disappointed by the result. In my opinion, the board adopted regulations, and while I fully support local control, and I think most people are aware, I was a huge advocate on this committee last year for the program. I was very concerned and outlined that in writing with some of my other colleagues, that the money would actually get to the intended students, which is ultimately what we care about. We care about making sure that the money gets to the students and that we work very closely to close our achievement gap, which is one of the reasons we designed this program. Can you sort of comment or help me understand what guidelines or regulations we're going to put forward to make sure that we can deploy that funding and really achieve those goals? And obviously, since we haven't seen any of the LCAPs yet, it's sort of hard to discuss. But again, I was concerned that the board seemed to give blank checks across the state without any significant accountability.
Sure. So, if you attended the January meeting and followed, you'd note it was, I think, 7 hours of testimony. It was quite a lengthy meeting. We had a lot of comments. Many of them were in support. Many also, raised concerns such as yours. And, as we continue our feedback process and reach out to stakeholders, we know folks are still concerned about some of the things they brought forward in January. And we're likely to see comments on the permanent regulations, which we'll work through, as we get those in, including specific suggestions for changes. What the expenditure regulations that are in place now, we think they were a good compromise. We think we got to a good place, not to say that there may not be changes that are needed in permanent regs or going forward as implementation of LCFF rolls out. You're right, we're really just starting to see how this is going to work. I will note that, again, the regulations did establish a consistent methodology statewide for determining how much supplemental and concentration grant funds an LEA gets in the interim years. There wasn't a good way to determine this. It'll be easy at full implementation. In the interim, we didn't have that. So we do lay out that formula, which I think folks agree was needed. And then it generates a percentage by which an LEA must show that they are increasing or improving services for their unduplicated students by above and beyond what they're doing for all students. There were, the regulations also address the issue of using supplemental and concentration grant funds district-wide, school-wide, county-wide, and charter-wide. And essentially they set some thresholds and for folks that had unduplicated students in numbers that were above thresholds. They could spend their funds this way as long as they talked about how they were meeting the needs of those students. Below those thresholds, you can still spend the funds for district-wide or school-wide services as long as you talk about how those are best meeting the needs of your students. So we feel like those address some of the concerns, although in January, you're right, that was one of the areas that concerns were raised, and we'll continue to look at those. And finally, which will help us in the permanent regulations, and as we work through this, LEAs will have to support and describe those things in their LCAP so we can see how those regulations are really being translated into what they're really doing, which will inform our permanent regs process. So, yeah, I understand your concerns. And
well, and that was the major concern, which was that resources that were really meant for a targeted population could be spent county-wide, district-wide, and frankly, while they may have some minor impact on that population, the funding would be diluted across the district, and I think that was very concerning because obviously that was not the intention. We obviously do want each of the local authorities to determine how best to deploy the money to be most effective, but there definitely was some concern that this funding would be diluted, that while they would be meeting the minimum level of that goal, that they really weren't frankly achieving that goal. And so I really want to deliver that message back to you, that you could deliver back to your board, that this is of significant concern, obviously for myself, and I think a number of other members came to that board meeting to raise that issue. And obviously, I fully understand that when you have a program that's just beginning, we're going to be monitoring and tweaking and constantly giving feedback. But this is just, early on, I think a major issue to watch out for. So as much as we can identify either performance measures or identify ways that we can track this on a much more close much more closely, I think would be, very, very important, because I wouldn't want to be having this conversation 3 or 4 years from now and saying, oh, well, we talked about this and now we see that that was actually true. I'd rather know going in that we identify metrics so we can, on an annual basis, really monitor this day one. And we're going to have ability to compare from district to district and from geography to geography. And while I know what works in the Bay Area may not work in the Central Valley, at least with the Central Valley districts, you could have some level of comparability, or amongst the Bay Area districts, you have some level of comparability. So I think it's important to really make sure that we don't see these outliers just like the superintendent salary. It's sort of having these outliers and then just acknowledging the outlier, then not doing anything about it. So I think it's absolutely imperative that we not only get the data, but then we have some sort of action plan so that we can act appropriately when we see something sort of remiss. So I think that was just my major point, was really my overall concern regarding the performance measures, the LCAPs. I'll be very interested to see, obviously, those being developed, but I think that's absolutely critical to the success of this program, because it's I think it's a great start that we are increasing this funding. I think it's much needed funding, but clearly the money, if the money doesn't get to where its intended target is, then obviously it's not going to achieve its goal.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Okay. I have a question for Ms. Ramos in the Department of Education. So we have this new system of school district support and intervention being created, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. Could you talk about when CD expects this new system to be fully operational, and also could you talk about whether this intervention model has been used in other states?
Sure. So it's the superintendent's intent to take a fiscal agent to the State Board of Education at their May or July board meeting. And at that point, shortly thereafter, the superintendent would like to work with, basically implement the board, so that the board of the collaborative is getting started at that time. So the vision is to have this rolling out very shortly. The same staff that frankly have been working on LCFF implementation are the same staff who will be working on the collaborative, so it's just been an issue of trying to get LCFF up and running. As for this type of model in other states, this type of model doesn't exist necessarily that we found in too many other states. We do see it in other countries, but what we have And I was going to say, and in our own state. And what we have seen is some districts in Napa, in Alameda, in Garden Grove are basically using a model of capacity building with some intervention functions. So it's really building off of some of the things that good districts are doing here in California.
So I guess actually tying this into our earlier discussion, so the LAO made the presentation where they indicated that intervention in a school district by the superintendent would occur only when a school district fails to improve student outcomes, when three conditions are met. When the school district fails to improve student outcomes 3 out of 4 consecutive years, the CCEE determines intervention is necessary, and the State Board of Equalization approves the intervention. So clearly this new system will be have an integral role in the intervention and accountability process.
It will, and I think it's the superintendent's vision as well that it's available if districts want to seek help. So if districts are seeking some help or looking for some best practices before hitting those places, that they're able to come to the collaborative and say, can you demonstrate some best practices or send us a team of folk who are expert in this particular area.
So then, if it's only when school districts want the help, I mean, going back to our earlier discussion, Mr. Ting asked the question about, who would have the power to essentially enforce and hold districts accountable in terms of, properly spending the dollars, and so it seems to come back to the County Office of Education. Is that correct?
I mean, it does come back to the County Office of Education. So just to clarify, it's not when districts just want help. It is also the collaborative is there for when they have reached that point and they need help, when they have not met their local goals.
Okay.
What I was saying is, in addition to that, they would like to provide support, along the way.
All right. So in terms of, I would ask this of all three bodies being represented in this panel, but in terms of holding districts accountable for the proper use of their taxpayer dollars, what is the best frontline agency or body that would enforce that accountability?
Well, so I'd just echo some of the comments that have already been made. Under the LCFF, there are multiple entities that are intended to hold districts accountable for meeting the spending regulations that were adopted by the board. The first line honestly, the first line of accountability is at the local level. At the state level, the legislature has said we want districts to demonstrate that they are involving their parents, involving their community in the decisions made about how they spend their money. So that's one of the state priority areas that we've laid out. So that's sort of the first line of defense. The second line of defense is the county offices of education that have to review their expenditures, or their LCAPs, and they have to ensure that their LCAPs and what they've said they're going to do actually lines up with what their budget says, how they're going to expend their funds. And if those aren't interwoven and meet up with one another, the county office of education will not approve their LCAP. And if they don't approve their LCAP, then they have to take steps to remedy that situation, so realign their activities or their expenditures so that they are in compliance with the regulations and what the state has set out. In terms of other fiscal accountability, we have annual auditing to ensure that what the district said that they were going to do is actually what they did. So those are sort of our three ways to ensure. There's no single final word, but we have all three of those hurdles that districts have to meet.
So I appreciate that overview with the proposed multi-level system of accountability. Does the LAO have an opinion as to whether the proposed system would have prevented the Centinela Valley situation that we're facing?
The LAO doesn't have I wouldn't say the LAO has a specific opinion, or we haven't pondered whether or not this would have prevented that. However, the new system that's in place does require districts to be quite forthcoming with their community members about what their strategies are for educating their students. So there are additional opportunities for the public to weigh in under the new system.
If I may add, Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. I think there's a couple key things to remember in terms of shifting from the old system to LCFF. What the state decided is to say we're going to pay less attention to the inputs. The thing that we care most about is outcomes, and the outcomes the state decided to define them through the state priority areas. So through the LCAP process, through the rubrics that will be adopted by the state board and review from county offices, we're focusing more on how are districts doing. Are they helping improve student learning? And if they are, that's great. And if they're not, how can we help them? So I think there is less. We don't have as many programs tied to categorical funding that has to be spent in a particular way. So I think that's one big change that's occurred. And I think on the issue of something like superintendent pay, I think it's just important to note that there never has been any specific regulations or restrictions on that. We have, before LCFF, revenue limit funding consisted of 2/3 of school districts funding roughly. So school districts had general flexibility to spend money however they wanted. So that this concern, which I can understand why there would be concern with the actions of the specific school district, is something that could have occurred in any of these situations. It's not something that is in light of LCFF or any light of changes. I think what Carolyn was saying is what we think is hopeful about LCFF and the LCAP process is that the state is focusing more on outcomes, but trying to create a little bit more transparency in the decisions that school districts make. So if you are going to spend a lot of your resources on something like that your budget needs to align, your LCAP, they all need to be aligned, and that you can clearly articulate why you're making the spending decisions that you're doing and how exactly you're expecting outcomes to improve.
I can appreciate that. I just want to make sure that the LCAP is designed to address these type of potential abuses, and under the current 8 priority areas, state priority areas, other than the general justification that somehow a certain compensation is necessary in order to identify any one of these student engagements, student outcomes. I mean, I can, I'm a lawyer. You give me the point that needs to be made, I can make the argument. But I just want to make sure that the LCAPs are designed so that they can address this kind of an abuse. Mr. DeBobany.
Yeah, our next panel will be composed of a number of superintendents, so I thought I'd ask for an overview from Mrs. Lynn and possibly Mrs. Ramos if you'd like to enter into the discussion. And just what are some of the challenges that local districts are seeing with the LCFF implementation? What type of support are you guys providing when these challenges come up? And also, I was curious to know, how are local school districts informing parents and trying to get them involved in the LCAP process, and how can we increase parent participation in that process?
Sure, and like you said, your second panel will give you a probably a much broader view of this than I can. Again, we are talking to education stakeholders. We're talking to districts. We're talking to many of the advocates. We're talking to many of the parent groups, and the LCAP template just came out in January. So folks really are, most of them, in that first phase of engaging with their community, and we've heard a lot of promising things. We'll be bringing a couple folks to the state board, a county office, and a district to talk about this. We'll also be bringing, we have families in schools coming who have developed some materials to model best practices for involving parents in the community. I think the PTA has also done some stuff. As the state board, we've asked folks to share with us their materials as they develop them, including any examples of districts who are using these materials or who they think are particularly good models, so we can post those on the website. So as districts are working with this, thinking about engaging in new ways, they have examples and they have places to go where they can touch on materials that give them ideas, resources for how to go about doing this. Again, we have heard challenges. Folks are struggling through filling out their first LCAP, and what we'll be releasing in the next couple weeks before the board meeting are some resources, some tips for how to fill out the LCAP. Most folks are generally comfortable with Section 1, which talks about engagement, but as they work through Sections 2 and 3, goal setting, specific actions, services, and expenditures, and supporting the regulations, districts are working through that section, and we've been working with them. Also very closely with CSESA, the County Superintendents Association, because they provide training to their 58 county offices of education, which then go out and touch their districts. So we've been trying to work with as many partners as possible to make sure that we hear all the questions so we can develop FAQs and provide resources that are needed, and that we can support them as they go out in their training efforts.
I just think that was pretty reflective of both the department and the board's experience.
All right. Lastly, I would just like to request that CD, you indicated that your plan is to present this new collaborative for educational excellence model by the May or July state board meetings. We would invite CD to provide an update on this collaborative, hopefully at our May hearing. Thank you very much, everyone. And now we would like to invite our second panel to get the local district and county office perspective by inviting Dr. Don Stabler, Deputy Superintendent, Torrance Unified School District, Dr. Rick Miller, Superintendent, Santa Ana Unified School District, Ida Buelna, Superintendent, Esparto Unified School District, and Tom Armelino, Superintendent of Shasta County Office of Education. Welcome to Sacramento. Thank you very much. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Stabler.
Thank you very much, Chairman Murasucci, members, and audience. My name is Dr. Don Stabler. I'm Deputy Superintendent of the Torrance Unified School District. I'm here today to tell you how we have progressed with the local control funding formula and the local control accountability plan. We are very appreciative of all the work that has gone on in the development of a school funding plan that puts local control at the heart of the process. Who knows better what the needs of our local students are than the local community? At this time, we have completed all of our consultations with the various community groups. Those groups were students, certificated and classified employees, administrators, parents, and especially parents of limited English and low-income foster youth. Each of those consultations began with an explanation of the purpose of the meeting, which was that, in their opinion, did we need to do to maximize student achievement. Those three words have become the mantra of our district. While you would have thought that the usual ideas would have been mentioned, but actually a common thread came from our employees, which was staff development. Every group mentioned it as a need if we were going to maximize student achievement. For students, their suggestions were to expand the academic and career counseling beyond the high school level and into the middle school. District staff have also met with groups of parents of identified low-income, limited English, and foster youth to explain the LCFF and get their input in the development of the LCAP. Each principal has held a school community meeting to introduce the idea of the LCAP. 2 community-wide meetings were held at which the LCFF was explained and comments were received from the participants. Once a draft of the LCAP is prepared, a meeting will be held with the district's parent advisory committee for their comments. One more public meeting will be held in May to present the plan to the community for their review and comment. It will be followed with the plan being brought forward for adoption by the Board of Education at its June meeting, along with the 2014-15 budget. And what will this 14-15 budget look like? Under the auspices of the LCFF, it will look very different from what we have been working under the last few years. We are able to reduce class size. Our model, which we think is unique, will be to move to 27-to-1s, gave grades traditional kindergarten through grade 5, with further reductions in class size at the middle school and high school level. We are upgrading our technology infrastructure to be ahead of the curve for the Common Core. We are also implementing a new counseling model at the high schools. The intent will be to be able to provide quality career and academic counseling for our students by taking some of the more clerical duties away from the counselors and giving them to a new job category, career guidance technician. While we have not finalized the LCAP, we are looking at ways to address the needs of our targeted students. Torrance Unified has roughly 37% unduplicated students qualifying for supplemental funds. Use of these funds will go toward meeting the goal I mentioned at the beginning, maximizing their student achievement. We are looking at implementing a mandatory summer program to give these targeted students a head start in their core subjects. We will also be opening up a student services center. Its purpose will be to offer a one-stop shopping experience for our parents and students when they enroll, apply for permits or free or reduced meals, or need to be processed for language or special needs. It was interesting. This was especially well received by the foster youth representatives we had, because they said when they go to a school and they're foster youth, they're identified immediately, and that's not a very positive experience. By going to the student service center and taking care of all their needs, then when they go to the school, they're a regular kid, they're a regular student, and they're not identified. I'd also make a couple comments about the governor's budget. We're very encouraged with the governor's proposed continuous appropriation. This gives school districts the tools to do the necessary long-range planning that is currently not there. While we are appreciative of what the LCF does for us financially, we can never forget that in 2021, when it is fully funded, it gets us back to what we received in 2007. Unless new funding is provided, we will continue to rank last in the country in funding for education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stabler. And again, I think we'll hold off on questions until we hear from all of the superintendents. And as we go to Dr. Miller next, I would just ask if each one of you can, at some point in your presentation, describe the demographics of your district, the percentage of unduplicated, the percentage of low-income English learners and foster kids. Thank you. Dr. Miller.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Rick Miller from Santa Ana Unified School District, and I thank you for this opportunity. I might also add anecdotally that I'm recently moved to Santa Ana. Prior to that time, I was in Riverside, and I think I'm completing my 25th year as a superintendent or something like that. I lose track after a while. As to our demographics, we're about 57,000 students in our particular district. We're the largest district in Orange County, and we're the 6th largest in the state. That being said, everything you probably think you know about Orange County, we're not. We're 96% Latino. We're 93% free and reduced lunch count eligibility. And if you disaggregate that further, we're actually 85% free only. So if you pull off the reduced part, because again, there's two metrics that are going on there that are combined together. So if you separate, we're basically 85% of our district is free. We have about 11% homeless, which in real numbers is about 6,000 students. We have about 50% English learners, and that's our demographic pattern. We are very engaged in the LCAP process because that will drive ultimately the LCFF process. And so we have intensive efforts taking place with our community. We have been focusing in the last month on internal stakeholders, and again, we have a variety of meetings. I know there's probably been 15, 18 meetings where different internal stakeholders come. We kind of give them a very brief presentation to explain what this is about, and then as we explain to them, it's really their opportunity to be talking, and so we have them get up and begin to work around on the various walls, writing their ideas relative to accountability and using the 8 state priorities as kind of buckets to store that information in. We've also done a similar activity with our students, and so I think we're up to about 10 rounds with students at the various high schools. We focused on the high school because we thought in terms of maturity, that's probably the best place for us to engage that question, and we've now begun similar activity with the local community, and differently than much of what happens in districts, we are actually going to the communities, and so the parents are not having to come to us, but rather we're going to them, and again, engaging in much the same way. It's interesting, yesterday morning at about this time, we had one of those engagements, and the response is very typical of the response we're getting, which is, wow, it's great to see you here, and thank you for this opportunity, representing the idea that historically, I don't think we as districts really reached out and engaged in the way that we're engaging. And the idea that somebody is there to listen. The other thing that parents have told me is we come to these meetings and you give us presentations and we nod and we get up and walk out rather than asking us what we think. And the large focus here is to focus on the parents and find out what they're thinking and talking about. And again, as we do these, we do them all in the primary language, essentially, of our constituents. Another piece of that, and I will leave these cards with you or you can distribute them. We give these out. They're both Spanish and English, depending upon the side. And I would point to two things on it. One is the website. And on the website, if you go to that, you will find that on the left-hand side, we're recording all those meetings. So if we met with a particular group, that's there. And then if you click on it, the URL basically takes you to the results of that. So again, in a transparent way, we're trying to record all the information that's out in front of us so people fully see it. Because again, I think that's been one of the lapses we've had before of thank you very much for the information. It goes into a black box. Nobody knows what happened to it. This way, it's going to be right out in front. The other thing is we have a number there that at any time people can call. There will be a real person that answers that rather than an answering machine. And that person will be bilingual, so they can accept whatever input somebody has in either language that they find preferable. We have also partnered with EdTrust West and with West Ed for two different purposes. EdTrust West basically help us with the facilitation process, getting closer to the community. And we think this is a one-time occurrence because, again, we're trying to figure this out as we go forward. With West Ed, we want them working with us to make sure that we're being accurate and unbiased in the data aggregation and in the report writing, because again we think that there's kind of some traps that people can, when they start to write, they begin to write what they want rather than write what people actually told them. So we're trying to engage those. We think those are healthy partnerships and will be very, very positive. Overall, we see this as a shift from equity of funding to equity of outcome, and that's a huge shift. And again, we talk about that as we have our various meetings. I think one of the questions is the uses of supplemental and concentration. I can't tell you that because we are in process. It would be premature to say that. On the other hand, I would suggest to you that with our students, meaning those that are engaged in poverty, poverty being the best descriptor probably that I would operate from, there's an issue of a lack of experience and a lack of access. They can certainly be great students, but when you take those two things away, it creates real difficulties. And so as an example, where we live, we're probably less than 10 miles away from a beach. And yet our students, many have never been to the beach. So when you talk about the ocean, talk about the beach, it's not going to resonate in quite the same way that with students that have actually experienced that. In a similar manner, when I first went to this district, went to a Friday night football game. That's not an uncommon event, but the stands were not, there was nobody in the stands, and yet it was basically one of our schools playing another of our schools. So we're talking about 4.5 miles apart, and there's inability to get transportation to get from one side of the community to the other, even though that's a fairly short distance. Again, representing some of the experiential and access issues that our students are facing, and I believe that those are the kinds of things, as well as internet and news media and so forth, that will begin to be overcome as we go forward with the LCAP, LCFF process. In listening to some of your comments earlier, I think one of the things, at least as we see it in our district, that will be a real turnaround piece that will guard against some of the concerns that you have is a much greater degree of transparency. And even as we meet with these groups, we have other groups coming forward saying, well, we're not on the list, we need to be on the list. And we're very open to that. There is a timeline issue at some point. The other thing is this is a long-term commitment, not a short-term commitment. In other words, we just don't do it this year in 13-14, and now we've done it and we're done. But we see ourselves coming back to this annually and having this kind of outreach to our various communities. With that, I think I'll terminate my comments.